Good morning. Welcome to this week's View on Africa. My name is Stephanie Walters. I'm a Senior Research Fellow at the Institute for Security Studies, and today we're going to be looking at the Democratic Republic of Congo and the political developments there since the contested elections of December 2018 led to the inauguration of Felix Tshisekedi as president of that country. One of the key issues that is continuing to be watched very closely in the DRC is how the relationship between the former president Kabila and Felix Tshisekedi and their respective political alliances is evolving. Now, Tshisekedi won the presidency, but we also know that the former president and his ruling coalition won an overwhelming majority in the National Assembly and in the provincial assemblies, and then subsequently in the Senate, which means that we're looking at a presidency which is severely restricted with regards to how much independence, how much room for maneuver it does have. So we have a president who's restricted by the former president, but we also have an alliance between the former president Kabila's political structures and the new president's political structures. How is all of this working out? And what does it mean for getting down to the business of development in the DRC, of creating economic opportunities, and of addressing the many, many social issues in that country and of security? Those are some of the questions that we're going to be looking at today. Now, I think the most obvious thing to begin with is the fact that it is now August, 8 months into a presidency, and we still do not have a formal cabinet. We do not have a government in the DRC. 2 months ago, a prime minister was finally designated. This was a very difficult process. According to the Congolese constitution, the designation of the prime minister is in the hands of the party that has the majority in the National Assembly. In other words, in this case, the party of the former president, Joseph Kabila. One of the reasons that the nomination of the president of the prime minister took such a very long time is because Tshisekedi rejected some of the initial proposals made by the Kabila camp, essentially because the nominations were of people who were so emblematic of the way in which Kabila governed in the past that Tshisekedi felt that this would not signal a real change between the past and the present. And that's important because, of course, what the Congolese people voted for and what they pushed for in pushing Kabila to leave office and not stand for a third term was change. And so as much as there is a political accommodation that is at the basis of this current political arrangement in the DRC, there is also a recognition that the Congolese people's desire for change needs to be taken into consideration. So that is what essentially hampered the nomination of the prime minister in the first few months of this year. Now, the current Prime Minister, Ikalamba, is not somebody who has a very high political profile. He was previously running the National Railroad system, and he is somebody who is considered to be somebody that Kabila can continue to manipulate, somebody who isn't going to impose his own views, his own opinions, or his own style necessarily on a future cabinet. So in other words, he will be someone that Kabila can continue to control from behind the scenes. This is important because one of the things that we are asking ourselves is how much change has really taken place, how much is Kabila still really involved, and how much is his former elite still really involved in governing. So that's the first thing. We do now have a prime minister, but it has taken a very long time to find that person and to identify him. This is not a person who we think will be able to create consensus across political parties or will even be trying to do that. So it's one indication of how we think government will operate when we finally do have one. Now, this question of when there will finally be a cabinet is an essential one. We've had negotiating teams both from the FCC and from CASH. CASH is the coalition that is formed by Felix Tshisekedi and his co-campaigner Vital Kamerhe, their political party. And we've had these negotiations now going on essentially since January. What we now know is that there has been agreement on the number of seats, the number of ministries that are going to go to each coalition. So Kabila's coalition will be getting 42 ministries, and Tshisekedi and Kamerhe's coalition will be getting 23 ministries. We had thought that once that particular element of these negotiations had been completed, that we would then see the nominations of the individuals who would take up these ministries. But again, we have been waiting and waiting and waiting. Now, there are a number of reasons why this is worrisome. One of them is, of course, that it's 8 months into a new presidency, and we've had people in the ministries without essentially the ability to really make things function. They're just sitting there, they're placeholders for a new government. This, in a country with this level of challenge on a social and economic front, is really wasting time that the country simply doesn't have, given the many different crises that it faces. And so it's worrisome, because where is the sense of urgency in this new government, and what is it preoccupied with? What is the presidency preoccupied with? What is the former ruling party preoccupied with? It seems one can conclude that they're preoccupied much more with their own access to power than with actually getting down to the business of governing. It also tells us a lot about what's going on within these individual coalitions. Now, we know that, for example, the ruling party, the former president's coalition, within that, there are a number of different kinds of views and strands that are competing with one another. In other words, it's not a homogeneous political platform that is that has a vision that unites that political platform. These are people who have been brought together and who have always been together out of a sense of opportunism, political opportunism, and as a result of the fact that Kabila was able to hold them together while he was in power. He had the ability to distribute patronage and therefore to keep his political platform together. Now that he is no longer in the presidency, although that coalition controls key institutions, it is a little bit harder, and it will become increasingly more difficult to keep that political platform together. One of the elements of patronage Kabila still has, of course, is cabinet positions. And so we know that one of the reasons that the nominations have taken such a long time is because it's inevitably people will become alienated. So some people will be nominated, other people won't be nominated, and the people who aren't nominated, what will happen? Will they drift away from former President Kabila, perhaps towards Tshisekedi or towards the other elements of the opposition? This is the balancing act that is going on within this coalition around Kabila. He's trying to keep together a group of disparate people who are there for essentially motivated by access to resources, and he has a limited number of resources that he can use to keep that coalition together. That's one of the reasons that this nomination is taking such a long time. On the other hand, we have the UDPS and the UNC, the two political parties that form the Cash coalition led by Felix Tshisekedi and Vital Kamerhe. Now, within the UDPS, we have a lot of competition over resources, over access to power. This is the first time this party is in power in its very long history of being in opposition. Felix Tshisekedi is a relatively new leader of that party. There are different views within the UDPS about whether or not he should have been that leader. And so a lot of competition as well within there for access to the key senior positions in government. Between Felix Tshisekedi and his partner in the coalition, Vital Kamerhe, also a lot of tensions. How many seats does the UDPS get in government? How many seats does the UNC get in government? And so a lot of these are the political balances and the political negotiations that mean that it's taking a very long time to actually form this government. And again, what it also means is that the elite in power, the governing elite of the DRC, is still very much preoccupied by its own access to power, its own access to resources, much more so than actually getting down to the business of governing. So this is a very worrisome trend. With regards to some of the promises that Tshisekedi has made, I think that Tshisekedi came into power knowing that he had the goodwill and the support of the population, not because they voted for him, but because they felt that his arrival in office meant change. It meant the change from from decades of having Kabila in power. And so people accepted that and were willing to extend their goodwill to this new presidency. I think, however, that people are starting to understand that this change hasn't led to anything tangible. So there is a new president, that president has a new name, but there isn't anything that they can take away from this 8 months into it. One of the things that Tshisekedi did very early on was launch relatively large-scale infrastructure projects in Kinshasa. So constructing flyovers in key parts of the city, trying to fix some of the roads, and so on and so forth. And this was something that people immediately pointed to after his election as, look at this, here's a new president, he's engaged, he really wants to make things happen. Now, not only were these efforts essentially limited to Kinshasa, but they've also taken a lot of time to be constructed there, and people are growing a bit impatient. And so I think that the period of goodwill that was extended to Felix Tshisekedi is starting to erode. In other parts of the country that have seen even less tangible change, people are becoming impatient. They want to see that things will be governed differently and that there will be a tangible change. And I think that with the government taking so long, people are starting to ask themselves some very, very difficult questions. I want to turn to the question of what has Tshisekedi achieved so far, because I do think that he has understood that some areas he needs to make progress on quickly. So as I mentioned, some of these quick win infrastructure projects, but also he has taken a much more conciliatory line with political opponents. He's allowed Moise Katumbi to come back to the country. He's allowed Jean-Pierre Bemba to come back to the country and to move around relatively freely. He has freed quite a lot of political prisoners from prisons, although there are still others who need to be freed, and a lot of, I think, procedures that could be put in place to accelerate that. He has also allowed essentially freedom of political assembly, freedom of speech, and so on. So a big difference from his predecessor, who essentially cracked down on a lot of those types of things, especially public protests. One of the other things that Tshisekedi has managed to do is re-engage with the international community. And I think this is where I'll end this particular short assessment. The international community, of course, has been watching this crisis for a very long time. Ultimately made its accommodations with the fact that Tshisekedi had come to power through whichever means. But there are a lot of questions about whether or not Tshisekedi can operate within this very restricted space with the National Assembly, the Senate, and the Provincial Assembly so dominated by former President Kabila, whether Tshisekedi really has the intention of fundamentally changing the way the country is governed. That's still very much an outstanding question. Whether he has the capacity to tackle some of the key issues, and this is a question that would have been asked of any newcomer because the challenges are so great. And so the international community is very much watching and waiting for key signs. And again, back to this government that we've all been waiting for, I think that is really where a lot of people will be looking at and analyzing how capable this new government is going to be and how it might lead the country in the future. But one of the really important things that Tshisekedi has managed to do, and I should say that the international community is very much wanting to support Tshisekedi. Some countries are more willing to put their support to Tshisekedi out front now without seeing a new government, without seeing more concrete action, and the US is one of them. Others are still adopting a wait-and-see attitude. But a key win is the re-engagement with the International Monetary Fund, which had been suspended since 2014 over controversy over mining contracts. Now, Tshisekedi managed to get the IMF to send an Article 4 mission to the country, which will essentially means that they are examining the fundamentals, examining issues around macro and microeconomics, but also questions of transparency. And so that is a really important element that Tshisekedi has managed to get, where he has managed to get the ball rolling. And I think that one of the things that Tshisekedi can do, and again, the question of whether or not he really intends to take the risks involved in doing this kind of thing and tackling corruption and tackling some of the entrenched patronage networks, But one of the things that he can do is essentially almost outsource some of that stuff. So that the International Monetary Fund, for example, will say, if you want us to re-engage, if you want us to give much needed budgetary support to the country, we're going to need to see some very concrete improvements in transparency, accountability, and corruption measures. And so Tshisekedi can present this essentially as, for the country to develop, for us to take a step forward and help our own population, we need to address these things. The IMF is imposing this, and I can't say no to that because my mandate as president is to serve the population. So it's one way for him to distance himself from some of the very difficult issues that need to be tackled and which will inevitably very much alienate his political ally, the former Kabila camp, because of course they are the ones who governed for so many years. And those are areas, these types of engagements are areas where I think the international community can play a very supportive role to Tshisekedi and help him both create his own space and more independence, but more crucially tackle some of the really long-standing governance, poor governance issues in the country.